katılımcılar, Türkiye Ulus Markalama Forumu'na tekrar hoş geldiniz.
Dear guests, welcome back to the Türkiye Nation Branding Forum.
İlk panelimizde dünyada ulus markalamada trendler, değişim ve dönüşümleri tartışacağız. Panelimizi sunucu partnerim TRT World editörü Yusuf Erin modere edecek.
Our first panel will discuss the current trends, changes, and transformations in nation branding, moderated by yours truly. I would like to invite our panelists to the stage. So as our panelists are coming to the stage, I'll give a brief introduction. We have Jose Filipe Torres. He's the CEO of Bloom Consulting, the gentleman sitting to the left of me. Sitting in the middle will be Gustavo Konixar, the Latin America Director of Future Brand. And on the very end, Muhterem İlgüner, the Türkiye Director of Brand Finance. Welcome, guests.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Now, before I open the floor to our guests who have presentations to make, nation branding, a topic that concerns everyone either directly or indirectly, because every single citizen, civilian, official of a country is part of that brand. Everyone is a citizen diplomat. Everyone communicates with someone projecting that brand, and hopefully inside your presentations today and afterwards, if we have time for some questions, we're going to get a much deeper understanding of how countries brand themselves and what they use. So without further ado, I want to give the floor to Mr. Torres to open with his presentation.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. So it's a very good question, and I think it's really important to understand what is a nation brand. That's the million-dollar question. What is a nation brand? And there is really no big consensus about what is a nation brand. There's many definitions. It's the image, it's the perception, it's so on and so forth. So we try to use a slide that explains what a nation brand is. A nation brand is this. Classic. It's not working. Thank you. So nation brand is this, is where, when you say the name of the country, the name of the city even, because it's also for city branding, it's the emotions, it's the feelings it generates. So when I hear the name Turkey or Türkiye, or when I hear the name of any other country, what is that emotion, what is that perception that is generating? This perception is extremely important for 5 groups of stakeholders. We talk about exports, so people that buy from the product or from the country. We talk about foreign direct investment. We talk about tourism. We talk about talent, and we also talk about prominence, which is the general reputation, so global citizens. So a nation brand is very important because the perception and what these audiences have, the perception they have about these countries or cities, influence the willingness to visit, to invest, to work, and so forth and so forth. And it's really important that countries understand this and that they can manage this. A very important component as well is the difference between nation branding and nation marketing. So we talk about nation brand, what is a nation brand? But nation branding is actually the act of managing and building and sometimes shifting perceptions about that nation or about that city. But it's very different from nation marketing. It's a completely different thing. They're 2 separate things. And maybe here in this panel you know the difference, but when you go out there, the difference is slim to none. There's a big confusion between nation branding and nation marketing. They are 2 completely different things. First and foremost, nation branding is something that comes first. Comes first to, in terms of a sequence of events. And nation marketing is something that comes after. Now, when we look into the next slide, you can see that when we talk about nation branding is about perception, And when we talk about nation marketing, it's about demand, generating demand. One is to build perceptions, is to work on these perceptions, and the other one is about to build demand. If you're going to go to the next slide. Perception is really built through actions, activities, and policies, and demand is generated by offers, by promotion. And go to the next slide. When we go into perception is really managing emotion and reputation, and when we talk about demand is about lead generation and transaction. Now, when we talk about all this, and if you are a policymaker, if you are the president of the country, you say, why do I care about emotion and reputation? I care about the next one, which is about the transactional part, the economic impact, because, you know, it's public money, so I want to see the return. So I just should go to the right one. Why should I care about the left one? Because, next slide, better perception leads to better demands. Without a good perception, without a positive perception, you are not able to generate demand. Next slide. So, I'm going to talk about predominantly about perception and the question about how can you quantify perception? How, if you cannot measure perception, why is it important? Because I can say it's very good for generating demand, but how important is that? And that's the million-dollar question, right? So understanding the value of perception, how much perception influences the transactional, the economic, and the social impact of the country. Next slide. Today, you have approximately 900,000 queries around the world about the nation branding and city branding theme. So every year, you have around the world people searching for 1 million times, almost 1 million times a year, topics related to city branding. Also included city marketing, nation branding, nation marketing, all those topics around there. So approximately 1 million. Next slide. You will see that the break approximately is 65% on nation branding. The other part is about nation marketing. But if you go to the next slide, what's important to see here is that only a 2% of all those million searches, so 15,000 searches, are generated by the sector about measurement. So there are 15,000 queries about how to measure nation brands. Next slide. When people search, what is that they find about this topic whenever they look for this information? They land in predominantly two places, consultancies like ours or academic papers. The two big depository, of course, there's many more other platforms, but these are the leaders that host most of the academic papers, which is Google Scholar and ResearchGate. There are 360 million research papers, not about nation branding, but in general hosted here. Out of those, you have 12,000 papers about nation and city branding. If you go to the next slide, and only you have 0.1 approximately, only 100 papers about measurement. It's very, very few. And all of those, from all of those, if you go to the next slide, from 0.1, next slide, 0 covers or can demonstrate the impact that nation brands have on the local economy. So how to measure nation brands, and what is the method to measure nation brands currently? Today, on the next slide, you will see that there are many indexes that measure nation brands in many shapes or forms. And all these indices you see here, all these rankings you see here, are very, very important because they raise questions, and they're really important. All of them are very important, some with some methodology, others with another, but they're important because they launch questions. People start asking, why am I in that position? What's happening there? It brings the uncomfortable conversation about where we are. So they are very, very important because they raise questions. And if you see the type of questions you have on the next slide, you will see questions like, how do I change perception? Why do I have that type of perception? Why does, this brand provide to the country? And so on and so forth. So this is questions that are very important and keeps the sector alive and keeps this conversation alive. But the problem is that it does not provide answers. Right? So can I change perception? How can I work? And because you cannot generate answers, or you cannot have answers, if you go to the next slide, it generates doubts. And on the next slide, you will see the types of questions that you'll start to have. And these questions are legitimate. You see, like, this is the responsibility of the tourism sector, not with me. Or we have other priorities. This is very important. Why should I invest in nation branding and in perception if I have roads to build, or schools to build? Right? And also generates other types of questions. This does not work. And gurus, really, marketing gurus, start talking, oh, it only works if you do it this way, my way. Right? That's a classic. So with this in mind, if you go on the next slide, we have decided to develop a study that is not commissioned by any country and that we're going to give for free for the sector. We are still in the progress of developing this study. It's a study that has been carried on for the last year and a half. And the objective of this study is exactly this. If you go to the next slide, is number one, understand how much positive perceptions about a place impact the economic and social performance. And the second objective is how much and what are the things that countries are doing that really influence perception, that can shift perception. Right now, if you go to the next slide, we are only in objective number one. We don't have yet answers, but I'm going to share some things with you about the first objective of our study. If you go to the next slide. So if you see currently, what I'm going to show you is three things. Number one, what is perception? It raises this question. You hear this a lot, like, okay, it's about the perception of other country, but what are the elements that build perception? What are the things that influence perception? What is more important? Is it the people, like you were saying, and very well about the ambassadors and so on? Is it the promotion? What are the things that influence perception? So we did a study about the elements that constitute perception, and also we've done, and I'm going to share with you some numbers about the impact of perception on the willingness to invest, on the willingness to visit, on the willingness to buy products from. And last but not least, I'm going to give you just a glimpse, because it's not concluded yet, about how those types of perceptions, or the elements that constitute the overall perception, pardon for the technical junction here, but how much those elements that constitute perception, which ones are influencing more the overall perception of a country or not. If you go to the next slide. So this study was developed in conjunction with City Nation Place, and also two institutions, academic institutions, and we're still working on this. Bloom Consulting is the main partner and the one that is financing this, but we're going to give it for everyone for free, that every country, every city can use, right? And included in this study, it's extremely important, we involve the countries, the regions, and the cities. So in the next slide, you will see that we have 48 countries, regions, and cities, and rising, involved in the study, providing data, because there's no data out there, so it's very important that the countries are involved. You see Turkey there as well, so Turkey is involved in this study as well, and many cities around the world. So, if you go to the next slide, we're going to talk first about what constitutes perception. Next slide and next slide. The elements you see here are the most important elements that contribute to the perception of countries, regions, and cities. These are what we call the 13 clouds. These are the clouds that, as a country, one has to measure to understand how you are performing from a perception point of view in all of these 13 clouds. Who says this? It's not us, but it's the countries, regions, and cities involved in the study. So after using a multi-criteria decision analysis process, we have reached a consensus around the world, a global consensus about the things that constitute perception about the country, a region, and a city. This is very important because you, of course, we're all here, we love this topic, we love this conversation, and probably this is not so surprising for you, but the minute you go outside and you say, well, I have to work on my perception about foreign affairs or at the educational level, the press, the journalists, start asking questions about why this, why not the other, etc., etc. So it's very important that we have a base to work on, that each country, in any part of the world, all of these affect differently the perception about countries and regions and cities. So, all that said, let's have a look a little bit about a couple of countries, specifically Turkey, how much the perception is affecting or influencing the willingness to. Okay, so if you go to the next slide, and the next slide, what you see here is an axis of the horizontal line is the perception of countries. So you see here from 1.5 to 4.5. These are love mark perceptions. So on the 1.5 is very, very negative. The 4.5 is very, very, very positive, right? Very few have 4.5 and none have 5. So the scale actually is from 0 to 5. Now, what you see here is on the vertical axis is the willingness to invest in a country, the willingness to visit the country, the willingness to buy from to live, to relocate to the country. How much perception is affecting the willingness of global citizens to go to a specific country or not, right? So if you go to the next slide, this is the countries, and for now we have the countries, but we're also working on the cities. And what you have here is really the perception of these countries. And what is fascinating about this slide, and for the ones that are not fascinated about data as much as we are, but what is really interesting at this slide is this line you see here, this dotted line here. This is the automatic calculation showing that there is a correlation between perception and willingness. The R you see on the top right, again for the non-mathematical people here, so the closest you get to 1, and you see it's 0.86, it's very, very close to 1, it shows it's bulletproof. It shows that there is a correlation between whatever we want to demonstrate. This is commonly accepted in other industries and other measurements, right? So, but not so much for perception, and this is the first time in such way it's done. There's other ways that are being done, but not like this. So you see that there is a trend, and that all the dots are very close to this line, and this is showing that there is this mathematical correlation between perception influencing the willingness to, right? So if you go, stay here please, but if you go on the increase of the perception, and this is very interesting, you see here increase of perception of a decimal, so 0.1, right? So imagine you move from 2.5 to 2.6, a decimal, you automatically increase by 3.3% the willingness to visit, to work, etc. in the country. In other words, you move 0.5, so from 2 to 2.5, you increment 15% the value of the country. And if you, in 1 point, it's 30%. It's a lot. It's a lot. And if you see this, for instance, from a continental approach, this is different. And if we focus on the next slide, we're going to see Turkey. You see where Turkey is on the study. So Turkey currently has a 3.2 perception, which is a moderately positive perception internationally. And it generates a willingness, it has a 60% willingness of people of investing, working. This is a good mark. This is when I say relatively positive, 3.2 is a good mark. And you see other brands, very strong brands, for instance, the UAE, or you have other brands there that are also at the same par, right? So this is how much the Türkiye brand is performing for the economy. You have a 3.2 perception, and it's increasing, or it's providing a 62% willingness, investing, working, and so on. If you go to the next slide, you can see that this number is different by continent. So you can see that the brand, for instance, affects a lot or much more, for instance, in Europe, than if you go into Asia or Middle East. Right? You see there the correlation on the right, so it's a 2% change, and on here it's a 4% change. If you go to the next one. And it affects differently on the objectives you have about the country. So for instance, for visitation, it's 3.1%. So a 1 decimal improve. If Turkey improves the perception of decimal, automatically tourists will want to, or will have a 3.2% increase in the value of the interest to visit the country. Will have a 3.1 on investing. And work and live is nearly a 4%, a decimal improve, a decimal. This is like Formula One. When you have the first car and the last car, and there's only 1 or 2 seconds difference, that's the kind of race we're talking here. So next slide, and then just a couple of 2 slides to show, which is, okay, so all those elements I mentioned about the perception about the country, all those clouds, all the elements that constitute perception, how much they impact the overall perception. And if you go to the next slide, this is not Turkey, this is just an example of a country, but you see, this is a specific country, country 1, and you see that country 1 has this perception distributed across those clouds, right? So in a way to monitor the elements that constitute perception validated by 48 countries, regions, and cities. Look at what happens when you decrease the perception of that same country or regions or city, or if you increase. Go to the next slide, please. Exactly, in this case it's increased. So you see that the cloud, this mark you see on the left, on the spider, it has increased, and automatically the perception of the country as a whole has changed. So what we're doing next, right now, is to work on what are the elements, what are the most important ones for countries to work on based on where they are, based on their history and so on. So this is not equal for country to country, right? So this is why we say that now, and this is as a trend and as something we've seen, and also the panelists, I'm going to talk, for sure going to talk about this, the measurement is really an important component to make this even more professional, to make even the nation brand sector more professional, because believe me, everyone here is very much aligned, understand what's the importance of this. You cross that door, there are other priorities. There are roads to build, people that have difficulties reaching the end of the month or have whatever, and that's really their priorities. This becomes a nice thing to have. And then you may say, no, but we're going to invest a lot. And you're going to say, okay, how much are you going to invest? 1 million? Yes. 10 million? I don't know. 100 million? Definitely not. Why not? Because if it brings value and if it gives return to the country, those 100 million will generate much more. And that's the objective of the study. So this is a trend. And with this data, with this information, this mindset, if you go to the next slide, it's what we say, Türkiye, it's time to shine. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Is my mic on? Thank you for that presentation. I greatly enjoyed it. How up to date is the data in the presentation?
Right. So the data is this year's. So we're working we expect to have the study concluded the first quarter of this year. At least the first objective is just to close it. But the data you're seeing here is from 2 months, so it's relatively new. So it has already. It was after the war has started.
Okay, so 3.2, that's a good score you're saying.
Yes, I'd say it's a good score. It's a good starting point, I would say.
Okay, but that means there's still a lot to improve as well.
Of
so
course.
hopefully we will see Türkiye shine even more in the upcoming period.